I have this question here from Kevin, and Kevin is saying, I just finished listening to your podcast on the ugly side of trust in romantic relationships, and I have a question. You spoke about trusting people with not only their good, but trusting them also in their bad. So, where does change and correction come in? Because I see people say, this is just how I am. And I've always felt it's foolishness to use that as justification for bad behavior or character instead of working on themselves. Oh, I did say this is a very good question here from Kevin, and he's referring to a question I answered on relationships and trust. And if you've not listened to it, I think it's important to listen to it. It's on the podcast, and it's called The Ugly Side of Trust in Romantic Relationships. And in that podcast, I kind of talked about how trust is about accepting people for their dependability and also accepting people for their frailty. That is, trusting people to succeed and trusting people to fail. And Kevin here is asking, so where does change come in if you accept people for their frailty? How do you get to change and correct people? And I said it's a very good question because this is something a lot of us aim at doing in our relationships. We aim to change. A lot of people get into relationships, especially romantic relationships, with an aim to accept all the good and change all the bad about a person, or all they consider bad. And as I say good and bad, I want us to see this as things we like and things we do not like, because sometimes some things aren't bad in the scheme of things, but then to us, because we do not accept them, they become bad. Like I gave an example about me being a very logical person and my wife being more of an emotional person. So I'm more logical than my wife. She's more emotional than I am. I can be emotional too, but then she's more emotional than I am. Now, being emotional is not a bad thing, but to a logical person, it becomes an irritation. Being logical is not a bad thing, but to an emotional person, it becomes an irritation. It seems kind of insensitive. And so when I use bad and good, what I'm trying to say is what we want and what we do not want. So a lot of us go into relationships with the mindset that we would go into this relationship and we would take everything, embrace everything that we like, everything that we want, and change everything we do not want. And this is where a lot of romantic relationships and marriages fail, when they realize that they cannot change those things that they do not want, or cannot change as easily those things that they do not want. Marriages fail there. They fail for two reasons. Someone that is trying to change the other person, and somebody that feels like they are being broken because they are trying to be changed by somebody else. Those two situations can be very frustrating situations that nobody wants to find themselves in. You don't want to find yourself at the losing end of trying to change somebody. And you don't want to find yourself at the receiving end of trying to be changed by someone by force. So change, a lot of times when we try to change people, a lot of times it's an illusion that we have that we can change people. I've come to realize that it's one of the hardest things to do, to change a human being. It's possible, but it's incredibly hard. And I will tell you why it's hard in answering Kevin's question. Kevin is saying, where does change come in? I'm reading a book at the moment, and I've had the book for a while, but I've never read it. I just like the title. I think I bought this book about 4 years ago or so. I just like the title. And that's why, sometimes you go out, you see a book, you like have the title, buy it and keep it, even if you never have the chance to read it. But now I have the chance to read it. I feel very led to read it, and I just started reading it. I've not gone too far in it, but then I think it's a book for now to give me understanding about some things. It's called The Power of Habit. The Power of Habit. Why we do what we do in life and business. It's a book by Duhigg. Charles Duhigg. So I would recommend it if you are interested in understanding why people act the way they do in life and in business. It's a very interesting book. He has done a lot of research on that book. He has assessed a lot of research, scientific research, and it's quite interesting, at least as far as I have gone. But then he buttresses the fact that habits are very deeply entrenched things in the human mind, the human brain. And it's very hard to change a person. It's very hard to change a person. And that's why when people get into relationships, one thing I tell them when they seek my advice in relationships is when you get into a relationship and you meet someone you love, and you see something you love about someone you love, the question you should ask yourself is how much do you love that thing to overlook or to withstand those things you do not love? So as you meet someone in a relationship, what you should assess are those things you like about them and those things you do not like about them. Very important. And what you must weigh is how much you love those things about them and how much you dislike those things that you don't like about them. And the things you love about them, does it totally outweigh those things you do not like about them? Do you love them enough to withstand, not want to change, to withstand, to live with those things that you do not love about them? Very important. Unfortunately, a lot of people get intoxicated with love, so their perspective is skewed. They do not see, they do not spend time. They do not see those things that they do not like. But when you spend enough time, you see character traits, behavioral patterns about people that you are not particularly comfortable with. And that's why courtship is very, very highly recommended. A period of courtship, very important. Very important. I think what makes relationships very dangerous today is because, number one, people are not willing to go through a period of courtship, what they call long courtship. So when they say date, court this person for a year, they're like, a year is too long. Like, why do we have to go a year? 2 months is okay, and let's start planning our wedding. Yes, I know there are marriages that have worked out that way. I once heard of a couple who had been married at that time for 19 years. This was before I got married. And they got married after meeting each other for 1 week. But those are the exception, not the norm. A lot of those relationships end up failing. 1 week, very, 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 very hard. You understand? A couple of months, even very hard. Because people conceal a lot, especially in today's age where a lot of people get to meet each other online. It's very dangerous because you don't get to see a lot about the person. And that's why long courtships are very important. Not to spot those things you love. Those things are on the surface. Those things you do not love are the ones that are deeply concealed. And a lot of times when we get into a relationship, we see those things. We go with the illusion that I will change it. I will change it because I love them. I will correct them and change it. So how do you change a human being? And why is it such a hard thing to do? Now, there are 4 different ways of changing a human being. 4 different ways, and I'm going to talk about those 4 different ways in answering Kevin's question. The number one way of changing a human being is to train them. Train them, and this is also called teaching. teaching. You train them, teaching. This can also be called discipline. You understand? So there's training, teaching, discipline. But I won't call it training. You train a human being. Training a human being is a very effective way of changing a person, of molding a person. Training. It's a very effective way. The problem with training is that it has a very small window. A lot of people don't understand that training a human being has a very small window. They think that window is perpetually open, but that's not true. Your ability to train a human being and a human being to be receptive of your training is not something a human being experiences for the whole of their lives. Training a human being to be in a to live a particular way, to take particular patterns of living is most effective, if not only effective, in the formative years of a person's life. That's why it's called the formative years. If you try to form a person, if you are setting out to form a person into a particular mold, it can only happen during that open window called their formative years, the early years. You see, my kids have something called Play-Doh. When we were younger, it was something called plasticine, but now they've refined it into something called Play-Doh. And when you buy it, it comes in a plastic bag where they don't allow air get into it. But then when you open it up, the first few moments of playing with it is still very malleable. You can form it into anything. I have some in my kids' study area, their learning area, where they formed it into different things, different molds of things, animals, vegetables, houses, and stuff. It's very soft. But then when you formed it and you leave it for a day, after a day, you come back the next day, it has hardened. It cannot form into anything again. You cannot form it into anything. It has become that thing. This is what training is like. Training is the Play-Doh when you bring it out of the plastic bag for the first time. This is how the human being is. And I dare to say this is not just about the human being. This is not just the human being that operates this way. Even animals operate this way. Now, if you listen to the podcast I did on the ugly side of trust in relationships, I talked about an experience with my dog, my male dog, where I put his foot down and I went into the house and it ate the food. And the female dog didn't eat the food. It waited for me to serve it the food. What I didn't give you was some context to these dogs. My male dog is an 8-year-old dog. My female dog is a 4-year-old dog. My male dog is the first dog I ever had in my life. Ever had. So when I got my male dog, I didn't know much about training a dog as a puppy. I just enjoyed playing with it. I just played with it. You understand? Played with it, threw the ball, stuff like that. Didn't train it much. It doesn't know many commands. Unlike my female dog. When I got my female dog, I'd had my male dog for about 4 years and some months. I'd learned a lot about dogs. And I learned the hard way. By dogs destroying stuff, chewing up shoes, not taking commands and stuff like that. And I corrected all that immediately I got my female dog. And that's why when I put their food down and I went away, my male dog climbed and ate the food because I never taught it patience in its formative years. For my female dog, I taught it patience. So it knows it doesn't take anything unless I give it, no matter how eager it is. The difference between my male dog and my female dog is what I did with them in their formative years. Their formative years, very important. That was the difference. That's why one could wait and the other couldn't. So when people listen to that podcast, they're like, why didn't you train that male dog? Because it's almost impossible to train that male dog now. Almost impossible. There's a saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. My male dog is already old. It's 8 years old. That's in dog years, multiplied by 7. That's how old it would be if it were a human being. It's like teaching a 50-something-year-old how to brush their teeth in a new way. Chances are you teach them today, by the time they wake up the next day, they will brush it the way they've been brushing it for the past 50 years. And why do they do this? Because there's a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia, it is where patterns are collected. It's deep inside the brain. Deep inside the brain. Your brain grows in layers. The basal ganglia is deep inside. It collects patterns. So when you teach somebody something that they didn't learn in their formative years, they revert back to what they had learned in their formative years, which is stored in their basal ganglia in their brain. That's why the formative years are very important. Very important. That's when you can train a human being. That's why the Bible says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he grows up, he shall not depart from it. So when you train a child, he or she learns patterns that's very hard for them to depart from, if not impossible. If not, but I don't think it's impossible, but it's very hard. So what I want to say about training is that not training is also a training. I did not train my dog to be patient. So by not training to be patient, I trained it to be impatient. So training is the first way you can change a human being. But the window is not always open. Early years, formative years, early years. For children, a lot of times, training is very easy. First 3-4 years, very easy. I don't say 5 years, very easy. But when you start going beyond that, it becomes harder and harder, because what they call neural pathways begin to be formed. Neural pathways, the way they solve problems, the way they see life, begin to be formed. There are pathways. They begin to tar those pathways in their mind of how things are done. It becomes very hard for you to change them when they've left their formative or childhood period. Now, the second way to change a human being is what I call straining. So there's training and there's straining. And straining is what people try to do when somebody has passed their training stage. So they've left their childhood stage, they've even left their teenage years. You can still try to change a teenager, but then when they get into adulthood or late teenage years, when you try to train and you realize that training is not working, teaching, they go back to they reset back to their original way of doing things. What people try to do that they call changing is straining. Straining. So they strain people to become a particular way. Straining has 2 aspects. It has shame and blame. Shame and blame. That's what happens in straining. In straining is shaming and blaming. A lot of what we call trainings today, a lot of them are straining. Straining. So when someone is training you as an adult, what they are doing is straining you. And there are 2 ways to strain a person: by shaming and blaming them. You see it every time. Sometimes it's subtle shame, sometimes it's outright shame. Sometimes it's subtle blame, sometimes it's outright blame. So what happens when you are going for a training on money management and say, oh, this guy is going to train you on money management? A lot of times, what it's going to do is train you to become a new type of person. And so the slight shaming. What they normally ask is, are you satisfied with where your money is right now? Are you satisfied with your spending habit right now? Aren't you tired of being broke? Aren't you tired of not having enough money to send to your parents? Aren't you tired of not being able to pay your rent? Shaming. It is not a training, it's a straining. Number one is to shame you enough to stop doing something. Because an adult is out of his training. You can't be trained anymore as an adult. It's training. Don't you want to be this? When you have somebody that is a particular weight size and they want them to become an optimal weight size, a lot of times it is straining. So the shame. Do you like the way you look in the mirror? Are you tired of seeing your love handles? Are you tired of having a pot belly? Are you tired of sucking it in every time you want to take a photo? It is straining. And one way of straining is shaming. Sometimes it is subtle, sometimes it is outright. When you go to a boot camp, it is outright shaming. When you go to the military and they are trying to train you, what they do is train you. They tell you how lazy you are, how fat you are, how useless you are, how weak you are. That is meant to motivate you to change as a person. It is training, not training. Because they cannot teach you like a child anymore who is receptive. What they try to do is force and break those neurological pathways. So a lot of times, straining is an effort to break people into what they should be. So like the Play-Doh, when it has been formed, you cannot mold it anymore. You have to break it. You break it so it doesn't become what it was anymore. The problem is, can it become what you want it to be anymore? It might become an image of something, but it won't hold together because you broke it. That's why a lot of you do training and training and training and training, and you can't remember what they trained you on 10 years ago. A lot of people do training and training and training and training about how to run a business. Give them 2 months, they go back to their terrible ways of running a business. A lot of people train and train and train and train their staff. The staff go back 1 week, 2 weeks later, they go back to the way of being very bad employees. Because what you do a lot of time is strain. Second part of straining is blame. Blame. So you are blamed for what happened. So you're like, your family couldn't go on vacation because of you, because of your terrible spending habits. You have diabetes because of your terrible eating habits. A lot of times that happens in the medical field. When they want you to change a lifestyle, they say blame. Blame. Your sight is bad because of your bad habits. You lost so much money. The bank does it too. You lost so much money because of this. So you are blamed for every failure in your life. Blame. It's another way of straining people to become a particular way, to change. Blame. It's called guilt tripping. You guilt trip people, young adults with habit problems, drug problems, and you call them what they call an intervention. A lot of times, aren't you tired? Aren't you tired of taking everybody's time? All the money that we spent on you, we can't do things with our money because of you. Think about your ways. Think about your ways and change. You're costing us too much money. Blame. Blame. So it's meant to break people to change. So some people change because they've been blamed. They change because they've been blamed. So strain is the second way of trying to change a person. It seems effective, but a lot of times there's a lot of destruction that goes in. It can be very destructive. Very destructive. It can be. So when you think you are changing a person by straining them, you're actually breaking them, where they are not what they were, but they are not anything meaningful either. So you strain people. Straining has to do with blaming and shaming, because that window of training has closed. A lot of times when you take people through blame, what happens with them is that they live with that blame, even when they've changed. They live with the guilt. That you see someone, oh, we got them to lose weight, but 2 months later, they're at their optimal weight. They take their own lives. They're like, why? He just achieved, but then the blame is still in their mind. I caused so much sadness. I made people expend so much money. I'm a terrible person. So they've changed, but then they've been destroyed. Now, the third way we go about trying to change people is constrain. Constrain. This can also be called taming. Taming. It's very different from strain, which has blame and shame. We have constrain. Constrain is when you try to control things around a person in order to get them to change. So a lot of times it has to do with withholding and controlling an environment. So try to get people by withholding, taking away. You want them to change, so you take away. You take away their phone. Take away their phone because you found that they have an issue with pornography or masturbation or betting, those kind of things. So you take away what seems to be the impulse, the cue. So you take it away. You take those things away and you try to control. You try to tame them. It's like putting somebody in a cage. You put a lion in a cage so it doesn't go out hunting. So you feed it the portion of food it's meant to have. They have very little choice. It's called constraining. So we constrain people because we want to change them. You constrain them. You take away the food from the fridge because you want them to eat healthy. You're not particularly training them. You're just constraining them to be what you want them to be. You constrain. So you're not shaming, you're not blaming, but you're constraining. You're withholding. You're conditioning the environment. So you're always on top of them. There's a God complex you have over them. It can be effective to change people. It can be. But then it makes people feel small. It doesn't help decision making. It makes them very weak in decision making, and it makes them want to depend on people to make a choice because they are so used to being strained. That's why when you take a lion out of the zoo that has been in the zoo for years, put it in the jungle, on a good day, a hyena should not be able to kill a lion. But a lion that has been kept in the zoo, never hunted, doesn't know how to hunt, can be killed by a hyena or a wild dog. Something that on a good day should be weaker than it. But because it hasn't learned its ability to decision make, it doesn't know what to do. So a lion that is taken out of the zoo, put in the wild, will die. Will most probably die. Not because it's a lion, but because it doesn't know how to live as a lion anymore. So when we constrain people, we limit them. They might change. They change by force because they don't see the availability of that thing. So one thing it does is that it makes them look up to you as God, every decision making, because you've learned to play God in their lives by taking away and adding. So you're the one that takes, you're the one that rewards. Another thing it does is it has the likelihood of heightening desire. So when you take somebody's phone away and says they're masturbating, watching pornography, betting, what it does is it builds a desire. It builds a desire in their mind. So they begin to masturbate in their mind, they begin to bet in their mind, and the one day they have the opportunity to hold the phone, they would do that terrible pattern. They would binge on it. They would binge on it because desire has been heightened. So you think they are changing. It seems like they are changing for a very long time, but then the day they actually fall, they fall so far. And that's the problem with things like Alcoholics Anonymous and things like that, where there's a withholding or rehab. It does that too. You withhold them. But then once you release them, they're like, okay, I've been free from this thing for a couple of months. But the one day they fall so far because there's no God around them to withhold anymore. That's the problem with constraining. It hardly changes people for long. And when it does change them, it has a way of getting back in a terrible way. When there's a small opening, when there's a small dip, there's devastating result. Now, the last way in which people can change, because when I talk about training is effective, when we talk about straining, it's effective but has very devastating result. Constraining can be effective, devastating result. Is all hope lost? No, all hope isn't lost. And this is where the podcast I did about the ugly side of trust comes in. The last way in which people can change is by claiming. Claim. When they are claimed, when you claim them. You see, the window of training is very small. That's why the Bible tells us train while a child is young. But sometimes we miss out on it. Sometimes we miss out. I missed out on training my male dog. I actually did. I missed out on it because I was ill-informed. Some people are ill-informed like that when it comes to childbearing. The first children, they have no knowledge. They are too excited. They do naming ceremony, do party, pamper the child. They don't train the child. So a lot of first children are like prototypes. All the errors of the moms and dads are expressed on that one. And they correct going forward. But then a human being is now lopsided. Now, all hope is not lost. I wouldn't totally advise us to strain or to constrain people. I wouldn't advise. It doesn't work a lot of times. It breaks them. All this means there are ways of breaking Play-Doh. It's breaking. One thing we can do is to claim. To claim people. Just like training is called teaching or discipline. Straining, blaming, shaming. Constraining is taming them like they're wild animals. You are the zookeeper. But claiming is love, is acceptance, is accepting them. The thing about this method of changing people is that it takes a lot of discipline on our side, and it is slow. It is very slow. But when we accept people, people do an interesting thing when they are accepted. When they feel accepted, something interesting happens. They begin to self-assess. When people are accepted, they begin to self-correct. They begin to self-correct. It might take time because love is proven over time. But when you accept people, they begin to self-correct. They begin to see life differently. It's a very powerful way of dealing with people, claiming them. Claiming them. Very powerful way. We see it a lot. Here we don't have so many shelters, animal shelters in Nigeria, but abroad there are so many. And you see this animal that has been abused, and people say this animal can do no good. It bites everybody. It does this. And someone says, I want that one that's biting people. I want. Are you sure you want this animal? We're going to put it down. And someone say, I want it. And they take that animal into their home and they wash it. They take care of it. There's a guy I used to watch. I've forgotten his name on YouTube. He has a dog sanctuary. Very big dog sanctuary. And he goes to places. At the time, there's a wild dog here. And he'll go to that dog. And that dog will be growling. Sometimes the dog will bite him. But he will take the dog. His name is Takis. 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 Just try watching him on YouTube. Rescues dogs. But these dogs, some of them are wild. They are wild. And he takes them. And after a while, a year later, you see the dog wagging his tail whenever it sees him. The dog doesn't bite people anymore. To the extent that people now begin to adopt these dogs from all over the world. And you see a dog that was once rejected for being wild. When somebody claims it and loves it and doesn't try to break it, just loves, just pours in love, you see that dog begins to self-correct. Because love is the ultimate reward. And with habits, just like I'm reading in this book, there are 3 stages. There's cue, there's routine, and there's reward. Habits are formed because of a reward we get at the end of the day. We have a propensity towards the things with the highest reward. The highest reward of a human being is to be loved and accepted. The highest reward in the human brain glows when there is love. Nothing creates more dopamine than love. When a human being feels loved, they begin to think, how can I get more of it? How can I become better? How can I be a better being? That's why I talk about spirituality, and I say spirituality in itself is a keen awareness of God and God's disposition towards us, not our disposition towards Him. When we think of our disposition towards God, we'll always be discouraged about who we are. But when we think of the fact that God loves us, no matter what we do or who we are, it changes us from the inside. I tell people the biggest way to change someone with a bad pattern of masturbation or pornography or betting or things is not by rejecting them. It's not by constraining them. It's not by straining them. It's not by shaming them or blaming them. It's by loving them. It's by telling them, I love you. I love you. And you know what? God loves you. Doesn't matter what you did yesterday. God loves you. I've done a podcast on masturbation and pornography. I think you should watch it. I think it's called Why So Many People Struggle with Pornography and Masturbation. because in the end, they feel God doesn't love them after they've done it. God loves you after you've done it. He loves you while you're doing it. It sounds ridiculous. It sounds like that doesn't work in changing anybody, but it does. Shame is what keeps people going back to bad habits. Love liberates people. Love is claiming people. When you claim people, people change. People change. People become better. I tell you, now when I was younger and I wasn't doing so well in school, and I felt like a failure. I felt like I couldn't do anything right, and it just began to dip from there. I became a terrible stammerer. I used to stutter a lot. But then I had this cousin that came to stay with us, and she made me feel like I was the best person God had ever made. Showed me so much love. And before I knew it, self-correction started coming. Not from my teachers, not from criticism, just knowing that I was better than I thought I was. Somebody, there was love. My cousin, much older than me, was sent as an angel to build my confidence. Because she accepted me. Everything. All. But then when I was young, I was so ashamed of myself. So I used to lie, tell lies, steal people's toys, do all those things because it all came from shame of, I'm no good. Because I thought school was an evidence of who I was. But here was somebody who overlooked all those things and accepted me and just took me, saw the good, and claimed. The same thing happened when I went to school in Canada. The difference between my school in Canada and my school in Obafemi Awolowo University was the love my lecturers poured into me in Canada. They didn't care whether I was black, whether I had an accent, whether I was Nigerian, whether I was male, whether I was female. They didn't care. They just poured love. And that made me want to be better as a graphic designer. On the other hand, people in Obafemi Awolowo University, a lot of them criticized, blamed, shamed. I remember being shamed by a lecturer. She asked a question and I couldn't answer. And I was looking, I didn't know what to say. And she told me, why was I looking at her like an owl? I will never forget. She said, why are you looking like an owl? And everybody in the class laughed. And my confidence sank. And at every single class, I was hoping never to be asked the question. They tried to strain us to be brilliant. But I went to a place in Canada where people claimed me. They made me feel brilliant even before I wrote a first exam. They told us how wonderful we were when they didn't even really know us. And then we tried our best to be better. I saw people who came to class, low lives, always came. Some people came half drunk to class. And I knew them as students. They came late, but teachers never chastised them. Said every time he came in, they'll say, "Oh, it's good to have you in class today. Thanks for joining us." And I saw those people months after proudly graduate and climb the podium with their families cheering for them. School became therapy because professors claimed. They didn't constrain, they didn't shame. And I saw people change. Real life. Claiming is the best way to change people. It doesn't feel like you're doing much to change them. It feels like, am I letting this thing go by? No. You're allowing them to change from the inside, which is the best way to change. You don't begin to break those neural pathways themselves. They begin to look at it and begin to revise it. In fact, they don't break it. They abandon them and begin to look for new neural pathways because they are loved. The reason why children are so receptive is because they come into the world feeling loved, not judged, not blamed, not constrained. I hope this answers Kevin's question. And for everybody out there that is thinking, you're in a relationship, you're thinking, how can I change? You've been resorting to straining and constraining people. I want to encourage you that when you love a human being, they self correct. When you love, they self correct. A lot of things I didn't teach my adult dog, it learns today because I love it. And then it wants me to love it some more. So he says, what do you expect me to do? Sit down and do this and stuff like that. It learns through love, through claiming. That's what God expects of us. That is how God treats us. He claims us. And by claiming us, we get to truly change.